Daniel Dillon, The Dollmaker's Son. Written by Tane Blackadder. Read by Arthur Howard. The silence in our booth at Mel's Griddle had a new quality to it lately, a texture I was still learning to decipher. For so long, the quiet between Daniel and me had been a heavy, inert thing, a shared burden of absence and memory that filled the space where conversation used to be. But now, it was different. It was no longer just the hollow echo of shared grief. It had become something softer, more fluid, a comfortable stillness that felt inhabited. It was punctuated by the gentle rhythmic rustle of Sarah turning a page in a medical journal, and the way Daniel's hand, the same hand that could deliver a blow of such brutal final efficiency, would occasionally drift across the cracked vinyl seat to find hers. Their fingers would interlace not with the desperate clutch of survivors, but with a quiet, settled ease, a silent language of mutual anchorage that had become as natural as breathing. I would glance up from my laptop, the cold blue glow of my spreadsheets, a stark contrast to the warm low light of the diner, and see the way his thumb would absently stroke her knuckle, a tiny unconscious gesture that spoke volumes of a peace I hadn't believed him capable of finding again. I was balancing our own books, the numbers a comforting, predictable constant in a world that was anything but. Debits and credits always summed to zero. It was a logic that the chaotic, bleeding heart of the city defiantly refused to follow. The beige phone on the Formica had been silent for a full week, a lull that should have felt like a reprieve, a chance to exhale. But in our line of work, prolonged quiet was rarely a blessing. It felt less like peace, and more like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting in the damp, greasy dark beyond Mel's windows, gathering its strength for the next storm it would inevitably send our way. The breath was released not by the phone's jangle, but by the door swinging open to admit a woman who moved like a startled bird. Clara Venter was an art teacher, her style a collection of soft, flowing fabrics and faded colors, but her posture was rigid with a nervous tension that seemed to vibrate the air around her. In her arms she cradled a bundle wrapped in a velvet cloth, holding it with the reverent caution one might afford a holy relic or a live bomb. Her eyes, wide and slightly magnified behind a pair of vintage spectacles, scanned the diner before landing on us. She'd heard about us, she stammered, from a friend of a friend. She didn't know who else to turn to. She moved with a jittery hesitation, her gaze darting around the diner as if expecting to be observed, before finally sliding into the booth opposite Daniel and me. Sarah, who had been nestled against Daniel's side, subtly shifted her posture. She didn't pull away, but her watchfulness intensified, her quiet, analytical empathy locking onto the woman's frayed nerves, diagnosing the silent panic in her shallow breaths and the white-knuckled grip she maintained on the bundle in her arms. Without a word of greeting, as if the act itself required all her courage, Clara began to unwrap the object swaddled in a piece of faded velvet cloth. The fabric, soft and worn with age, fell away in folds to reveal what lay within. It was a porcelain doll sitting primly in the cradle of her hands. At a glance it was exquisitely made, a testament to a vanishing craft. It wore a dress of antique lace, yellowed with time but perfectly stitched. Its cheeks were touched with a finely painted blush, a delicate hue that suggested life, and its hair was a cascade of meticulously crafted golden ringlets, each one a tiny work of art. But its eyes were all wrong. They were the piece that shattered the illusion of innocent craftsmanship. They were not the simple painted dots or the bland, glossy glass beads of a common toy. These were complex, detailed orbs of hand-blown glass, so masterfully executed that they held intricate two-human iris patterns, starbursts of green and gold that seemed to shift in the low light. Worse than their beauty was their depth. They seemed to capture and hold the diner's dim illumination, reflecting it back not as a simple highlight, but with a knowing, almost conscious quality. They weren't just seeing, they were perceiving. It was deeply unsettling, a violation of the natural order that separated the living from the inanimate. "My father," Clara began, her voice a tremulous thread threatening to snap under the weight of her story. She cleared her throat, a fragile sound. "Alistair Venter. He was a dollmaker, a true artist." She paused, her own eyes glistening behind her spectacles. "He passed away 3 months ago." She swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet booth, and her fingers, as if seeking comfort from the very object that unnerved her, came up to nervously stroke the doll's cool, smooth shoulder. "I've been clearing out his workshop, and I've found others." Her voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "Dozens of them, all with different faces, different clothes, but all of them with these eyes." The word was expelled on a breath of pure dread, naming the source of the terror that had driven her to our door. She believed the dolls contained secrets. Children had gone missing from the old neighborhood over the years, she explained. Not a flood, just a slow, chilling trickle, one every few years. The police had investigations that led nowhere, eventually filed away as runaways or tragic accidents. But Clara, surrounded by her father's final, silent creations, had begun to see faces in the porcelain. The curl of a lip she remembered from a missing poster, the distinctive shade of a boy's hair, perfectly replicated in painted ceramic. "He was a gentleman," she insisted, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "He loved children. He couldn't have hurt anyone. But something is terribly wrong. I can feel it in these dolls. They're not just dolls, they're records." Daniel Ever, the investigator, spoke. "Records of what, Clara?" "I don't know," she whispered. "But I think he was trying to tell me something, to tell someone." Daniel hadn't taken his eyes off the doll. He wasn't looking at it as a curio or a piece of art. He was assessing it as evidence, a crime scene in miniature. "Why come to us?" he asked, his voice low. "This sounds like a matter for the police." "The police closed the files," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of steel. "They said my father was just an eccentric old man. They don't see what I see. But you look for the things other people miss." Her gaze swept over the three of us, a desperate faith in her eyes. "You speak to the ghosts." Sarah reached out, not touching the doll, but laying her hand near it on the table. Her healer's eyes were fixed on its face. "The craftsmanship is anatomical," she murmured. "It's not just artistic. The proportions are perfect. The set of the jaw, the spacing of the eyes. It's like a portrait." "A portrait," Clara echoed, her voice hollow. "Yes, that's it exactly." Daniel gave that single sharp nod I knew so well. The pact was made. We would speak to this particular ghost. Clara Venter's workshop was a time capsule of dust and memory nestled in the garage behind Clara's small house. The air was thick with the ghosts of clay dust and varnish. Shelves lined the walls, populated by a silent, staring audience of porcelain children. It was an unnerving gallery. Under the stark beam of Daniel's flashlight, their collective gaze felt accusatory, a jury of the lost. My role, as always, was to find the pattern, the ledger hidden within the art. While Daniel and Sarah examined the workshop for physical clues, a hidden ledger, a coded note, a supplier's invoice that felt off, I began the painstaking work of cataloguing the dolls. I photographed each one, noting their distinctive features, a freckle pattern here, a unique hair whirl there, a specific shade of green in the eyes. I then cross-referenced these features with the digital archives of missing children cases from the past 2 decades, casting a wide net around the city and the surrounding counties. It was slow, macabre work. I felt like a grim historian, trying to match the living to the lifeless. Hours bled into one another. Daniel found nothing in the workshop but tools and raw materials. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the click of my camera and the soft sound of Sarah's breathing as she studied a doll with fiery red hair. Then I found it. "Daniel, Sarah," I said, my voice unnaturally loud in the hush. They gathered around my laptop. On the screen was a side-by-side comparison. On the left, a doll with a distinctive lopsided smile and a single dimple on its right cheek. On the right, a scanned photograph from a 10-year-old missing persons report, a boy named Leo Petrov. The smile was identical, the dimple a perfect match. "It's him," Sarah breathed, her hand going to her mouth. "It's a perfect likeness." "It's more than a likeness," I said, a cold certainty settling in my bones. It's a replica. The connection was the break we needed, a single solid thread in a tapestry of the bizarre, but it only served to deepen the central, horrifying mystery. The confirmation that the doll was a perfect replica of Leo Petrov slammed a door shut on any notion of coincidence, but it opened a chasm into something far darker. We stood there, in the dust-choked silence of the workshop, surrounded by dozens of these serene porcelain faces, and the same unanswerable questions echoed in all our minds. Why would a gentle artist, a man described by his daughter as a soul of profound kindness, secretly immortalize missing children in clay and glass? Was it a secret memorial, a grieving artist's way of ensuring these lost souls were never forgotten, creating a silent, hidden cemetery of art? Or was it something profane, a trophy, a serial collector's gruesome catalogue of his victories over innocence? The latter thought was so vile it felt like a physical stain in the air. Each possibility was a path into a different kind of nightmare, and the questions themselves, hanging there in the motes of dust dancing in our flashlight beams, were more terrifying than any concrete answer could have been. The not-knowing painted pictures in the mind that were worse than any reality. With the grim validation of my digital match, the investigation fractured into 3 specialized fronts. Daniel, his jaw set in a line of grim resolve, became a ghost in the neighborhood's past. Armed with the name Leo Petrov and the specific time frame of his disappearance a decade prior, he began the slow, painstaking work of stirring old memories. He visited tired pubs and quiet park benches, talking to old-timers who had seen generations come and go, his questions subtle, probing for any forgotten thread that might have connected a lonely dollmaker to a vanished boy. Did anyone remember Mr. Venter having visitors? Were there ever rumors about his workshop? About cars that came late at night? He was sifting through the emotional sediment of a community, looking for a single glinting piece of truth. Simultaneously, Sarah, leveraging the professional trust of her medical network, embarked on a more scientific track. Her healer's mind focused on the physicality of the dolls, the how of their creation. To her, the porcelain and the glass eyes were not just materials, they were evidence. She took detailed, high-resolution photographs of the eye's uncanny structures, noting the specific swirls of color and the almost microscopic imperfections of hand-blown glass. She began reaching out to ophthalmologists and forensic artists, and quietly contacted a materials scientist she knew from the hospital, asking about the composition of specialty porcelains and the supply chains for such bespoke, high-quality glass. She was, in essence, attempting to diagnose the doll's origin, to find a unique supplier whose records might lead us back to the commissioner of this terrible gallery. We were no longer just looking for a man. We were tracing the very dust from which these silent, screaming children were made. I stayed with the data, the grim arithmetic of loss. Another match surfaced, then another. A girl with a strawberry blonde braid, a boy with a distinctive port wine stain on his neck. With each confirmed match, the collection transformed from an eccentric hobby into a systematic, years-long project, a gallery of the stolen. Sarah's search yielded the next critical thread. The glass for the eyes was a proprietary blend, ordered in small, expensive batches from a high-end art supply company in Germany. The shipments were paid for by a shell corporation, one I recognized. Its tentacles had brushed against the edges of the Metro goods case. It was a holding company used by a man named Silas, the same coldly pragmatic strategist who had been Hernandez's right-hand man before his organization was fractured. He was a ghost, a facilitator for the city's worst predators, and he had been paying Clara Venter's bills. The pieces clicked into place with a dreadful final logic. Silas wasn't just in the business of moving people, he was in the business of catering to the most depraved tastes. And Clara Venter, the gentle artist, hadn't been a willing participant. We arranged to meet Clara at her home that evening to share our horrifying findings. The sun had set, and the old house was filled with deep, shifting shadows. We sat in her living room, the Leo Petrov doll sitting on the coffee table between us, its lopsided smile now a grimace in the flickering light of a single candle. Daniel laid it out with a brutal, necessary clarity. Your father wasn't harming these children, Clara. He was being forced to work for the man who took them. Silas. Clara's face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. Forced? To do what? To make dolls? Not just dolls, Sarah said softly, her gaze fixed on the doll's face. Her nurse's mind had been working on the how, and she had arrived at the same terrible conclusion I had. Clara, your father was a sculptor, a master of capturing likeness. These aren't just artistic interpretations. She took a slow breath, her voice filled with a profound pity. I believe Silas was bringing him the children, alive, and your father. He was making casts. The word hung in the air, ugly and final. Casts? Clara whispered, her eyes wide with incomprehension. Death masks, I said, the term feeling like ash in my mouth. He was immortalizing their faces in clay, creating a perfect negative from which he could pour the porcelain. A permanent, unaging record. A commission for a client who wanted to keep them forever. The tragedy of it was absolute. The gentle dollmaker, coerced with threats to his own daughter, forced to use his sacred art to create trophies from the most vile crime imaginable. He couldn't save the children, but he could bear witness. He could ensure they were not forgotten, hiding their stolen lives in plain sight, in a form so unsettling that it would one day lead his own daughter to our door. Clara made a small choked sound, her hand flying to her mouth as the full, grotesque truth crashed down upon her. The dolls she had dusted and cared for were not her father's gentle legacy. They were his silent scream, his confession carved in porcelain, each one a monument to a life extinguished and a soul he had been forced to imprison in art. In the heavy silence that followed, the Leo Petrov doll seemed to watch us, its two human eyes reflecting the candlelight, no longer unsettling, but infinitely sad. The ghost had been given a voice, and in its silent porcelain face we saw the reflection of a father's damnation and the terrible price of a love twisted into a weapon.